Let's begin with something that might make you uncomfortable. Your ego is not you. It's not who you truly are. It's the mask you wear every day, the projection of yourself that you show to the world, the identity that you've built from your experiences, your fears, and your desires. But here's the problem. This mask, this persona, has a power over you. The ego begins to dictate how you see yourself, how you interact with others, and how you respond to life. And the moment you begin to over-identify with it, you risk losing touch with the truth of who you are beneath it. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, gave us the language to understand this internal conflict. Freud's model of the mind divides our psyche into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is our primal instincts, our desires, our unconscious urges. The superego is our moral compass, the voice of social norms and ethics. And then there's the ego, the middleman, the mediator between these forces, trying to balance the raw urges of the id with the often impossible demands of the superego and the constraints of the external world. But while the ego's task is to maintain balance, Freud knew that it was a difficult and precarious position. The ego is born out of necessity, out of the need for survival, for managing our impulses in a way that allows us to function in society. It keeps us from acting on every urge we feel. It allows us to present a more acceptable version of ourselves to the world. But here's the catch. The more we identify with the ego, the more we start to believe that it is who we are. We begin to see ourselves through the lens of the ego and not the true self beneath. We start to mistake the mask for the person behind it. And once that happens, we start to lose our true sense of self. Freud often described the ego as the rational part of the psyche, the one that deals with reality. But when the ego becomes inflated, when it becomes more concerned with preserving its image than staying true to the real self, it can become dangerous. The ego begins to take on a life of its own, dictating your actions, manipulating your thoughts, and most importantly, creating an identity that is built on external validation. The ego thrives on being recognized. It lives for approval, for praise, for admiration. And the more it gets, the stronger it becomes, further distorting your sense of who you really are. But as Freud would warn, this becomes a trap. When you are overly attached to the ego, you begin to act out of fear. Fear of being exposed for who you really are. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, and most importantly, fear of being insignificant. Freud pointed out that the ego is often motivated by defense mechanisms, mental processes we use to protect ourselves from emotional pain, conflict, or anxiety. These defense mechanisms, such as repression, denial, projection, and rationalization, are not inherently bad. In fact, they help us survive difficult situations. But when the ego relies too heavily on them, it prevents us from growing, from confronting our true selves. Freud's theory of repression is particularly important here. He believed that many of our deepest desires, fears, and traumas are pushed into the unconscious mind because they are too painful or uncomfortable to deal with. But the ego doesn't simply discard these desires. Instead, it buries them in the unconscious, where they continue to influence our behavior without our awareness. This hidden content shapes our decisions, our relationships, and our sense of identity, even though we don't realize it. For instance, consider how we react to criticism. When our ego is overly inflated, even the slightest criticism can feel like a blow to our very existence. In these moments, the ego is on high alert, trying to protect us from feelings of inadequacy or rejection. The defense mechanisms kick in: denial, repression, projection. And instead of facing the criticism and learning from it, we lash out, deny the validity of the feedback, or project our own insecurities onto others. The more the ego is fed, the more it protects itself from anything that might threaten its sense of importance. But in doing so, we become disconnected from our true selves, from growth, from learning. So how do we deal with the ego in a way that allows us to live authentically and avoid being trapped by this defensive, illusory structure? The first step is acknowledging the ego's role in our lives. Freud taught us that the ego is not inherently bad. It has a necessary function to mediate between our instincts and the external world. But the moment we start over-identifying with the ego, when we allow it to control our behavior, shape our identities, and define our worth, we lose touch with reality. We begin to believe that the ego is the ultimate version of who we are, and we forget that it is only a part of us. The key to dealing with the ego is not to reject it, but to understand it. It's about recognizing when the ego is driving our actions and when it is distorting our reality. The more self-aware we become, the better we can manage the influence of the ego. Self-awareness, according to Freud, is not just about understanding our conscious thoughts, but about recognizing the unconscious forces that drive us, our unresolved conflicts, our repressed desires, and our deeply ingrained fears. Freud believed that true personal growth could only occur when we brought these unconscious forces into the light. He called this process insight, the moment when we became aware of our hidden motivations and how they influenced our behavior. When we bring awareness to our ego-driven behaviors, we can begin to untangle the layers of defense that have built up over the years. We start to recognize when we are acting out of fear, insecurity, or pride. And once we do that, we can begin to make choices that align with our true selves, rather than the false narrative the ego tries to convince us is our identity. For example, think about the last time you felt deeply offended by someone's words or actions. In those moments, how much of that anger was truly about the other person's behavior, and how much of it was a defense mechanism to protect the fragile ego? When the ego feels threatened, it reacts. It defends, it justifies, it rationalizes. But this is precisely when the ego is at its weakest. When we are aware of these defensive reactions, we can choose to step back and look at the situation objectively. We can ask ourselves, am I reacting out of fear? Is my ego in control right now? What is this response really about? Freud's concept of the ego also involves its relationship to the reality principle. The ego, in its healthy form, serves to balance the demands of the id, our unconscious desires, and the moralistic pressures of the superego. It's the ego's job to find realistic ways to satisfy our desires, even if that means waiting or compromising. But the ego, when inflated, can distort the reality principle. It no longer operates to balance internal conflict. It becomes fixated on external success, control, and validation. It loses sight of what is truly necessary for our psychological and emotional well-being. In order to break free from this distorted reality, we need to learn to detach from the ego. This doesn't mean we should eliminate it, but rather, we need to recognize when it is manipulating our perception of reality. Freud taught us that the ego can become a tyrant if we allow it to rule unchecked. The first step is to create space between ourselves and the ego. This is where mindfulness and self-reflection come into play. When we become present with ourselves, when we quiet the mind and observe our thoughts without judgment, we begin to recognize the difference between the ego's demands and our true needs. So, what happens when we begin to separate from the ego? We begin to live more authentically. We stop relying on external validation to feel worthy. We stop identifying ourselves based on what we do, how we look, or what others think of us. Instead, we start to connect with our inner selves, with the quiet wisdom that lies beneath the noise of the ego. We begin to see that true self-worth does not come from achievements, accolades, or possessions, but from knowing and accepting who we are at our core. Freud's work on the ego was groundbreaking, but his ideas don't just apply to psychoanalysis. They apply to everyday life. Our egos are everywhere, in our relationships, our careers, our self-image. The key to true psychological freedom is not in controlling the ego or eliminating it, but in learning how to let it serve us, rather than control us. So next time your ego tries to take over, remember this. You are not your ego. You are not the mask. You are not the identity it projects. You are the one who sees the mask. You are the one who can choose to act with authenticity and self-awareness. And that, my friend, is where true freedom begins.